A dachshund's a lovable, underslung hound, a cute little sausage so close to the ground. But one little puppy by chance came to be a new kind of branch on his family tree. He was such an ugly dachshund, such an unorthodox dachshund, with legs long as willows and paws big as pillows. Ugh, such an ugly dachshund. Hello there. My name is Brutus, and I'm a dog, a big dog. What kind of dog, you ask? Well, I'm a... Oh, now, wait a minute. If I tell you what kind of a dog I am, that might spoil the story I want to tell you. Let's just put it this way. I thought I was a dachshund, but believe me, I was the ugliest dachshund anyone ever saw. It all started the day I was born at Dr. Pruitt's dog hospital. Now, if I'd been an only son, there wouldn't have been any story. But on the same day I was born, my 4 brothers and sisters also arrived. My mother was warm and affectionate, but she just didn't have enough milk to go around, and so the kindly doctor had to feed me out of a bottle. On the very same day that I was born, although of course I didn't know it at the time, a Monty dachshund named Danke was in the hospital having some babies. As a matter of fact, that's how the story all began. Dr. Pruitt realized that Danke had more than enough milk to go around, and could very well take care of another puppy in addition to her own. So he suggested to Mr. Garrison, Danke's owner, that he adopt me and let Danke be my foster mother. Mr. Garrison, who thought big dogs were much more pleasant to have around the house than little ones, thought this was a wonderful idea. So it all started, and I moved into the Garrison household and became an extra child for Danke, who was most kind and motherly toward me, I must admit. As you may have noticed, human beings act rather strangely at times, and Fran and Mark Garrison were no exception. You see, Mark had conveniently not said a word to his wife about me. She thought I was a doxy like my sisters. But after a few days, Fran began to worry about me. She thought my head and feet were out of proportion to the rest of me. Ours was a secret that couldn't be kept very long. Every day I grew bigger and clumsier and more unlike a dachshund. It soon became obvious to Fran, and she was furious with her husband and called him Sneaky. She relented a little when Mark told her I would have starved if Danke hadn't adopted me. When I was weaned, Fran was all for giving me back to Dr. Pruitt. But Mark was so happy at having a big dog around the house and so unhappy at the thought of giving me up that Fran relented again and gave me to Mark for his birthday. And so our happy life at the Garrisons began. Mark painting pictures happily out in his studio, Fran cooking and cleaning and knitting and babying us, Danke being a wonderful mother to Chloe, Heidi, Wilhelmina, and of course, me. I really loved my sisters and did everything I could to imitate them. The way they walked, the way they barked, the way they played, and this got me into a great deal of trouble. For they were small and quick and close to the ground, and every day I got bigger and clumsier and farther from the ground. And when I tried to follow them under furniture, I just wound up tipping things over. I was such an ugly dachshund, such an unorthodox dachshund, with legs long as willows and paws big as pillows. Ugh, such an ugly dachshund. My sisters were very playful and got into things they shouldn't, like all puppies will. But every time I tried to join in the fun, disaster. Now, there was the time we pulled the yarn caper. You see, Fran had been knitting a big woolly sweater for Mark, and had put it down to go out to Mark's studio. Near her chair was a big round tube-like box full of balls of yarn. Well, the minute Fran left the room, the Doxies started to play with the yarn. Chloe took a ball and went one way, and Heidi took another ball and went another way, and Wilhelmina took the sweater and went a third way, and it began unraveling as she went. Faster and faster, the Doxies scurried around the room, under the furniture, over the chairs, around the lamps, trailing wool yarn behind them. Well, it looked like great fun, so I bounded over to the yarn box to see if there was any left, and got my whole head stuck in the box. When I couldn't get the box off my head, I'll admit I pushed the panic button and began to run wildly around the room. I couldn't see where I was going and ran into the grand piano, which caused the top to fall down with a loud bang. Now this brought Fran back, running, and since the Doxies had retired to their basket and were looking innocent, I got the blame for the whole fiasco. Now, Fran was a little unhappy with me about the way I'd messed up her living room, but it was Mark who got angry after we pulled off the studio caper.
It isn't much fun being one of a kind, forgotten, left out, or just lagging behind. If only somebody somewhere could be found to love this big lug of a love-hungry hound. I was not an ugly dachshund, not an unorthodox dachshund, for I was a doxy only by proxy. Ugh, such an ugly dachshund.
Again, it was the Doxies who started the whole thing, but I got pretty well mixed up in it. And just when things were at their worst, Donka arrived on the scene and hustled the Doxies off into the house. So when Fran and Mark arrived and saw Mark's paints kind of spread around his studio and me with a couple of his best paintings stuck to my paws, they jumped to the conclusion that I'd been responsible for the whole mess. Well, that night in their bedroom, Fran, in bed with the Doxies around her, was adding up the cost of the calamity. $20 to scrape the studio floor, $23 to replace 2 windows, $12 to repair 1 easel. Mark interrupted to say that, after all, it was his studio. But then Fran went on about the living room damage. $18 for replacing the couch slipcover, $92 to replace the vase that Fran's mother had given her, and so forth and so forth. Well, I was outside looking in, and the family looked so warm and cozy, and I felt so cold and left out, and I began to howl. And then I saw Mark coming over to let me in, and it made me so happy that I bounded into the room and jumped onto the bed with the Doxies. Well, disaster again. The bed fell down. That was the last straw. Mark agreed with Fran that I should be returned to Dr. Pruitt in the morning, and they put me out into the garage to sleep.
I was such an ugly dachshund, such an unsnuggly dachshund, unwelcome to nap on a couch or a lap. I was such an ugly dachshund.
Well, if I hadn't pulled off the copper caper that night, my happy times at the Garrisons would have ended. You see, it happened this way. Officer Carmody of the local police and Mark Garrison weren't exactly the best of friends. As a matter of fact, on the day the Doxies were born, when Mark and Fran were rushing Donka to the hospital, Officer Carmody had written a traffic ticket for Mark that set a new record for number of violations and amount of fine. Now, the good officer was very proud of this, but it didn't make Mark feel so happy. Now, Officer Carmody had been assigned to the Garrison's neighborhood because of a report of night prowlers. He'd told Mark Garrison to be on the lookout for suspects, and so I was on the alert, too. And it wasn't long after Mark put me into the garage that I heard suspicious noises outside. Now, it only took just a little bump to get the door open, and sure enough, there was a suspicious guy with a flashlight lurking in the Garrison garden. I went after him like a flash and ran him out into the front yard and up a tree, and I kept him there all night. I thought it rather odd that he kept calling for Mr. Garrison, but Mark was a sound sleeper and didn't hear him. The next morning, I discovered to my surprise that the prowler was none other than Officer Carmody. But Mark was so pleased with the way I guarded their house and showed Fran how I had kept Officer Carmody up a tree all night long, so I got another reprieve. The next evening, Mark and Fran were discussing me. I jumped up in Fran's lap to show my affection, but she pushed me off with a laugh. "You're no lapdog, Brutus," she said. And then to Mark, "We'll never have any peace around here until Brutus stops thinking he's a dachshund." Well, Mark got a quizzical look on his face after that remark, went out of the room, and returned with a book. "Look at this, Brutus," he said to me. So I looked at the pictures in the book. "Now, pay close attention. This is important. You see this dog? It's a dachshund." Well, I looked, and sure enough, it was a picture of a doxy. "They're dachshunds, but not you. You're not a dachshund and never will be." Now Mark turned to another picture in the book and showed that to me. "Here's what you are, Brutus," he said, "a Great Dane." Well, I took a good look at the most handsome dog I'd ever seen. So I was a Great Dane. Well, that was more like it. Why hadn't they told me before?
I was not an ugly dachshund, not an unorthodox dachshund, for I was a doxy, only by proxy. I had no cause to complain. I was really a handsome Great Dane.
Things went better for me for quite a while after that. They went so well that Fran decided she could risk throwing a big party beside their swimming pool. Since so many people were going to be invited, Fran hired Mr. Toyama and his son Kenjo to help with the food and the decorations. They spent most of the day preparing for the big event. Japanese lanterns were strung all around the garden. The refreshments were set up on tables under a little awning. Everything was going so well, I decided to inspect. That was a mistake. For when Mr. Toyama saw me, he was frightened to death. "Ryan!" he yelled, "Ryan!" And he shinnied up into the top branches of a tree. I tried to tell him I was no lion by barking my loudest barks. When Fran and Mark came running, they again misunderstood, and I wound up tied to the clothesline pole in the service area, far from the party. So I was banished from the party, but the doxies were also supposed to stay away. Though I didn't know it at the time, the plot was thicker than a bowl of dog food. It seems that Fran had an idea of entering Chloe, the best-looking of my sisters, in a dog show. So she had invited one of the bigwigs from the show to the party, and had arranged for Chloe to be seen by him, just by accident, you know. Well, it went well. The bigwig suggested that Chloe be entered all right, but when she was supposed to make her exit and rejoin her sisters, she declined. First, she stole a big roast beef bone from Mr. Toyama. Then, since she was the biggest tease of them all, she brought it over where I was tied up. Right in front of my nose she began to chew away, all the time making little sounds of pure enjoyment. Well, I couldn't stand it. I barked a little and strained at my moorings a little, and what do you know? Broke loose. Well, I was after Chloe like a shot, but she's a quick one, and headed straight for the middle of all the people at the party. I'll admit I got a little carried away chasing her, and the awning did fall down, and the tables with the food collapsed, and 6 or 7 guests did fall into the pool before Mark collared me. The scene was quite a shambles. Well, as Fran surveyed the desolation the next morning, she gave Mark a final ultimatum. I must go. And Mark sadly agreed with her. Just then, a big rubbish truck backed into the driveway to take away the debris of last night's party. Chloe, like the little nut she is, was still scrounging around in the trash looking for leftovers. All of a sudden, she was scooped up and dumped into the rubbish truck. Now, I saw what happened and began barking and scratching at the sides of the truck. But the truck driver and Mark and Fran didn't seem to understand, and Fran just got more annoyed with me for making so much noise. I kept it up, and so Mark started dragging me away. But I broke away from him and ran back to the truck and began jumping up the sides. Mark finally got the idea. "There's something in the truck," he said. And at the same moment, Fran said worriedly, Why, where's Chloe?" So Mark climbed up into the truck, and sure enough, there was Chloe half buried in the rubbish. Well, Fran was so happy that I'd saved Chloe that I was granted another reprieve. As the time for the dog show came near, Fran spent most of her time with Chloe, training her. Mark got the idea of giving me a little training. He gave me a few instructions as to how to walk and heel, and I'm afraid I wasn't very good at it at first. My feet seemed to get in the way of my feet, and Fran thought the whole thing was highly hilarious. Now, this made Mark a little angry, so he said to me, "Come on, Brutus," and we jumped into the car and went over to see Dr. Pruitt. It turned out that Mark was really serious about entering me in the dog show, and he asked Dr. Pruitt for help and advice. Well, the doc said he thought it was a good idea, but that it would take a lot of hard work on the part of all of us. And so, for the next few weekends, work we did. Actually, all this was kept highly secret. When the big day of the dog show arrived, neither Fran nor Chloe knew that I was to be entered as well. At the dog show, we discovered that the Dachshunds and the Danes were judged in different rooms, and therefore there was no danger of Fran discovering what we were up to. It was a colorful and exciting scene with all the people and the handsome dogs, and I must admit I was a little nervous. When my turn came to parade around the ring with Mark, I saw standing on the sidelines a woman with a little Dachshund in her arms. The little Dachshund looked exactly like my sisters, and for a moment I forgot I was a Great Dane and began walking around the ring with my tummy almost on the ground. Mark was horrified, and the judge almost fell off his bench. When Dr. Pruitt saw what was happening, he put his hat over the Dachshund's head, and the next time I came around, I didn't see the Dachshund, but instead saw standing near her a beautiful female Great Dane. I mean, she was a knockout. Well, I immediately became the most Danish Great Dane ever, and must admit to showing off quite a bit. As I marched proudly around the ring, the judge couldn't believe his eyes. He thought it was two different dogs. Almost before I knew what was happening, Mark held a blue ribbon in his hand, and I had won. Chloe only won the second prize, and when Fran learned that I had been entered and had won the blue ribbon, she was so proud of me that all was forgiven. So we all went back to the Garrison house and had a party. Fran and Mark were as happy as I had ever seen them. For a change, they were thinking of each other instead of Dachshunds and Danes. As for me, I was dreaming of that beautiful female and wondering how I could arrange to meet her someday.
He was not an ugly dachshund, not an unorthodox-un, for he was a doxy, only by proxy. He had no cause to complain. He was really a handsome Great Dane.